Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week, I'm speaking with Katie Hartsock, author of Wolf Trees, about the tradition, so to speak. We cover a few topics, but we focus on Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, as well as a short essay by Borges called Kafka and His Precursors. We also talk a little bit about an essay Katie had in an issue of the New Criterion a few months ago called The Old and the New, which is about classical translations and adaptations and revisions. And I'll do some like housekeeping stuff at the end. Also, very minor announcement for those of you who are into watching your podcasts on YouTube rather than listening to them on a podcast app. SLEERICKETS is now on YouTube. There are a couple episodes I had to omit for dumb technical reasons, but pretty much all of the main feeds episodes are up on YouTube now. And you can watch them there. There is no visual. The visual is just the SLEERICKETS logo, but the show's up there if you prefer it there, or if there are people you know who only listen to things through that medium. Please do recommend it. Pass it along to them. I will put a link in the show notes. All right, thanks very much. And here is my conversation with Katie Hartsock, author of Wolf Trees.
There are a couple different ways people use the term wolf tree, which was sort of what drew me to it, that there didn't seem to be not even an agreed upon definition, but also any clear origin. Like if you look back, I tried to read a bunch of places to find out where, and the best I could find that it was a forestry term that emerged in maybe the 1920s or so, but very unclear. So one way to think of a wolf tree is that when the forest was cut down for farmland, one or two trees might be left for shade, for pasture trees, or for pasture animals. And so they could, because there's no competition for sunlight or rain, they get to be these really enormous, wide-spreading trees that you might think like, what's the movie? The Shawshank Redemption. You know, that tree where they're in the middle of the field and it's like huge. So like kind of like, I think those silhouettes of trees and fields were part of my like imagination as a child who grew up close to rural parts of Ohio and seeing that like the one living thing in the field, well, the one tree in the field. And then you can also use wolf tree as when those farms have failed and then a younger forest grows up around that tree. And this happens more in New England, where you can be wandering through like a relatively younger forest and then you come upon this former pasture tree that they also call a wolf tree. So it's like this huge gnarled, kind of craggy, like can maybe be decomposing. But the idea is that like because it's so large and huge, it has provided, as you were saying, like a lot of life for, you know, animals to nest in, things like that. And then when it does decompose, which as you said, don't cut it down, then it still becomes a house and a source of nutrition.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't even thought about that. That it's almost like the inverse of a bonsai, where that enormous spreading tree is in some way an unnatural silhouette, that it's meant to be hemmed in and kept in check by competition.
Yeah. And one of the main topics of wolf trees is living with type 1 diabetes, which I couldn't write about for a long time because it just felt so suffused into my everyday life. But when I heard the term wolf tree and I learned what it was, something about the idea of wolf trees being a remnant of a former ecology, like a leftover kind of from what used to be there, that like made me, I was like, okay, now I can write about the diabetes.
And is type 1 diabetes, is it theorized to be like an evolutionary adaptation kind of gone a little too far in some cases, or what's the?
Yeah, it's an autoimmune disease. And your system attacks the cells that should be processing all your food and turning it into like good sugar and nutrition. So an untreated type 1, actually, because like you eat, but your body isn't processing that or translating that into nutrition for your body. So you actually are starving to death, even though you eat. It's really a weird contradiction. You can be eating. Your body, it isn't actually getting it. So And it's fascinating how far back it goes. Like there's these ancient medical texts, like ancient Greeks knew about diabetes and its
Yeah.
symptoms.
The
Um,
thing with the ants, which I had not heard before.
yeah, yeah. That like, and I think that was a Roman idea that like they took the urine of diabetics and when ants flocked to it because that's how your body gets rid of the what you do eat if you're an untreated type 1 diabetic, you are also really thirsty all the time, which is one of the
Right.
classic symptoms. And I remember when I was a late onset type 1 diabetic, but I have these memories
Oh.
of getting up in the night to like, I mean, at one point I think I just actually put my mouth under the faucet in the middle of the night and just like drank like it was a lake. But that's because your body's just trying to get rid of all that extra stuff by pissing it out.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's like, yeah. But the Roman doctors figured out that something was different about the pee because ants would go to it, which
And that's
is
the diabetes mellitus or
mellitus. Yes, that's how it got that surname mellitus
sweet.
because it's
Yeah.
like the sweet part. And then the diabetes is actually ancient Greek for sieve because you're just like it's a diabetes like to go through.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I hadn't thought
Yeah.
about that.
And I'll just add one more favorite
Yeah,
etymology.
please.
Insula is Latin for island, and
Insula. Oh, yeah, yeah.
the researchers found the right islands in blood that to
Oh,
replicate in artificial insulin. That's why insulin's called insulin. It's like island. It's so crazy.
they're supplying, they're recreating the island that is
Exactly.
lacking. Okay, I see.
Exactly. The island that got attacked by its own systems.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it is, yeah, it is. Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, the wolf tree is the image, and then diabetes is one of the themes that goes through it. But yeah, I mean, I think the other thing it made me think of, particularly reading your essay, was because I know I've read before, like marine biologists talk about the importance of like a whale corpse to
Mm.
the
Mhm.
ecosystem at the bottom of the ocean, that it becomes like like basically like this colossal city for all of the things living on it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that and the wolf tree. Even I got obsessed with evolution, when our daughters were really young, because you do see like the all these individual lives of billions of organisms being kind of recapitulated in little, tendencies or perfections of form in a life right now. But I mean, the other
Like the
obvious,
last,
yeah.
that's
Sorry,
like
go
the
ahead.
poem. That's like the last poem in your book, Midlife.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I think, yeah, it
Love that
really,
title, An Organ of Extreme Perfection. I love that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's from a subheading in the Origin of Species. It's,
That's great. Oh,
yeah,
cool. Very
yeah,
cool.
because it's a he's talking about basically like the contestation from people who did thought his theories were wrong, was like, which you still hear today.
Yep.
It was like, oh, but what's half an eyeball worth? What's half a wing worth? And he was like, well, it's worth better than nothing, actually.
Yeah.
It turns out if your eyeball can only tell light from dark, that's still an advantage, and that's
Still
what
worth it.
happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I was just like the other big analogy that came to mind was that of the tradition as a kind of a wolf tree or a whale corpse, or this
Wow. I
this
love that.
thing that is, which yeah, I mean, I think like there are a handful of big obvious objections to Eliot's essay that I I think I came in to them at a slightly different angle this time, and I still found plenty that I disagreed with, but
Mm.
yeah, like it felt like there were maybe some other ways of coming at it than I had come at it in the past. But do you want to, for, I think many, if not most of the people listening will be loosely familiar with the essay. Do you want to give a kind of a primer? You're actually the professor here. You want to give us a little bit of a primer on what we're talking about?
Sure. So this essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, first published in 1919, and I still give it to my students who love to, as we just been talking about, love to disagree with it,
Mhm.
and then also sometimes reluctantly agree with it.
Yeah.
And it's good. It's good for them to disagree with stuff. They don't do it enough. So I quoted it because there's a central metaphor in it that's important to me. I quoted it in the recent New Criterion essay, The Old and the New, where I am talking about revisionary poetry, which is broadly defined as poems that retell a mythical narrative from a new perspective or with a new sequence of events.
And you
Um,
you make a good distinction between that and revisionist.
Yeah, which some of my some authors I really like, Alicia Ostriker, Rachel Duplessis, like they use that term revisionist, and I just don't think that seems too too much an agenda on
Yeah,
its mind. Like it knows what it wants to say, it's going to say it, and that it wants to replace something. It
yeah,
wants to become the correct updated version. Whereas like revisionary, I really prefer that term because well, first of all, it has visionary in it. And I think we're used to thinking of visionary as the
yeah,
future, but I think you can be visionary while you're thinking about the past. And and it sees possibilities, and it's more focused on like affirming the unknown through what is known, or finding something new in the past that hasn't been said yet.
yeah.
But then
And
still not.
I thought of like Cameron just now finished his exams. He's a student at Oxford, and I always get thrown a little bit because he uses the verb revise. He says, "Oh, I'm just revising," and what he means is we would say he's reviewing. He's studying.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's so
But they
interesting.
use the verb revise for that.
Huh. That's cool.
Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with that use of it. Although it makes sense, because when you are preparing for exams, it does feel like you're just trying to fix yourself
Yeah.
or something. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but
Right.
so in writing that essay, which a lot of the material came from my dissertation, which I'm hoping like to kind of return to eventually as maybe a kind of more of like a public humanities book kind of a thing. And
Yeah,
this
I
essay,
was gonna say it seemed like you it was I forget where it was. There was a little like suggestion or mention of your dissertation, and it was either in that essay or elsewhere, but it seemed like it was at least like possibly fodder for a more like general audience book.
that's what I'm hoping it might become. Yeah. And to go from like dissertation, then this essay is just kind of a nice stepping stone into that, what I, like to do. Um, young children and writing new books, you know how that is.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but I quoted the Eliot part, which is my favorite part of the essay, where he makes a visual metaphor of what you might be calling like a whale corpse or a wolf tree, which I love that distinction. But that there's the important literary works are somehow monuments, which does sound kind of like self-important, but I also kind of think of
yeah.
them almost sometimes as like a chessboard or something, and just kind of like a Greek temple in ruins or something moving around.
Mm.
I don't know, it's always struck me that that it's always complete, he says, but when there's a really new work, the monuments shift to allow that new work into them. So like this order that is simultaneously always complete is also always shifting, which I think that was one of my
Yeah,
key understanding the importance of like knowing the past, but also being visionary with it, and like seeing how it can change. So with the essay, like I think that's the main part I quoted in my essay. But when I teach it, because I'm always trying to emphasize to students the importance of reading authors from more than 50 years ago, which
yeah, oh God,
um,
yeah,
yeah, and and also like you were saying, to be on the lookout for being surprised by threads or surprises that feel like modernist or even like postmodernist, or like surprising in their uncanny effects. Like, and I think that's a lot of what Borges was writing about in the Kafka and his precursors essay you sent, was like, oh, these things that are so old, they actually have these glimmers that feel super relevant and strange and new.
yeah. The line, I'll try to read it because the first part of this essay, I mean, I was struck by how many of these remarks about critical discussions today, which of course is critical discussions 100 years ago, felt still
Right.
quite contemporary, down to like seldom perhaps does the word traditional appear except in a phrase of censure. And that
Exactly.
when we praise a poet upon it is our tendency to insist upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. That a lot of that felt, and in fact, like it occurred to me like that's even how we talk about Eliot. You're like,
Hmm.
oh, he's breaking the tradition. He's doing something so new
Right.
that's what's really important about him. But he does say, as you I'm trying to find the oh yeah here. So he says, what happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. Whoever has approved this idea of order of the form of European of English literature will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And that, I think, like one of the big and obvious objections to this essay and to Eliot in general is that he has he does refer to, European or Western tradition a lot. And I think there's a suggestion, though he does address it, that like, oh, if you're going to be a poet, like for one thing, you have to read the whole Western tradition. For another thing, there is a whole Western tradition, and here's what it is, and here's what's the important parts, and that's the canon.
Mm-hmm.
And reading the Kafka essay or the Borges essay, which is very short, but it basically is a suggestion that, as he says, a great writer invents his predecessors.
Mm-hmm.
That the people who wrote before you, who led up to you, are in fact, they didn't lead up to you until you existed, and then you create a new thread of them. He identifies several very disparate influences on Kafka, and he says none of them resemble one another.
Right.
But in the context of Kafka, we recognize in them all a common element.
Mm-hmm.
But Kafka needed to exist before that element could emerge from them. And it reminded me a little bit of I read with Ashley and McHugh a while ago the first couple essays in the Dyer's Hand, the Auden book.
Mm.
And he has a really wonderful description of the library, the internal library, where he talks about like, oh, well, in fact, in this library, War and Peace was written before Hamlet. And and there are like several different copies of this book, and some of them are different. Some of them take place in this city, and some take place in another city. And then there's a joke about the Anatomy of Melancholy is only 10 pages long. I thought it was much longer. And but like to me, that in a way, like that and the Borges essay clarified for me a little bit Eliot's insistence on the tradition, which in part is this, I think. It's the way, like, I understand English is that we all ultimately, everyone has his own English because it's such a big language. We don't all know exactly the same words. We certainly don't use the same patterns of words precisely. There's an enormous amount of overlap, but part of the pleasure of a language is that every speaker speaks it slightly differently. And similarly, every reader, and Eliot, I think I quite like it. He says, "We persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness." That which suggests that that Auden's approach to that internal library and tradition might not be so far off from Eliot's. I mean, Eliot like read a shit ton of books, probably more than most of us can, but I don't think it means that it's not ultimately still a slightly idiosyncratic tradition.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think that he says very clearly, if the only form of tradition of handing down consists in of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition, in quotes he puts, should positively be discouraged. Yeah. And so I think he's really emphasizing idiosyncrasy. And the Borges seems to me to be an addition, not so much like a disagreement.
Yeah.
What he's talking about, whereas like that the past can actually, knowing authors and works from the past, the present helps us kind of realign them and re-see them, and how they're like leading up and connected in a network, in a web that I don't want to use any internet metaphors, but like that we didn't know existed until, like, as you said, until a writer like Kafka comes along and shines a light and says, well, actually, no, all this is kind of necessary to me, but I've also created the possibility of its network. And what I like about the Borges essay, especially, is that like, he goes outside the Western tradition. The first fable he quotes is by Han Yu, writer from 9th century China. And yeah, so I think there it can be, and especially to students, like there's like these days they're so kind of like ready to resist Western canon, and I think that there's good reasons for that, but I think there's also ways that it can hinder their development as readers and writers, because
Oh,
they kind of, you know, subconsciously biasing them against things that can actually be, as you said, like idiosyncratic, welcoming, exciting.
yeah,
And
yeah. Ellie at one point refers to, and I think you're exactly right. Like I do like Borges quietly expands from like, well, we're not actually limiting ourselves to the Western tradition, and even like from a slightly more global perspective, like it starts to feel weird to say like, well, Greek is the same as like English, and like that's one Europe, like whereas the Greeks are really
right.
like immersed in Easterners.
Yeah.
But Eliot says yeah, here it is. He being a poet must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. And there, like I was reminded, like, oh yeah, Shakespeare and Homer are pillars in the canon, like they're fucking miles apart.
Miles.
And then
Miles.
cave paintings are partly like this is all, and in fact, it is that they can be linked together is a testament to their genius and to what's so strange and remarkable about them.
And I'd also say it's a testament to, you know, we can visualize and understand the processes of how choices are made about the canon and see like, okay, well, once you start to lump Shakespeare and Homer together, then that's something that happened that we can say, you know, someone did that. It's not like they're inherently together. I mean, that's actually kind of a
Yeah.
Borges moment to connect Shakespeare and Homer in the same way he can identify precursors to Kafka.
Yeah.
And I also studied when I was at Northwestern, this new kind of way of looking at classics as it actually separates itself from what used to be the classical tradition, capital C, capital T, and it's
Yeah.
called classical receptions,
Mm-hmm.
which is much more about understanding that unlike a kind of educational system like perhaps the British or the German classics education that kind of presents it as like monolithic. You have to know this. This is like, these are the things you need to know in order to call yourself educated in classics. They don't change. Like this is the syllabus basically.
Yeah.
And the syllabus has been the same for 2000 years. Well, that's crazy. You know, this like that's
Yeah.
crazy. And
Yeah.
so the classical receptions scholars are much more thinking about democratizing classics and, you know, even taking small moments like when most people think of Medea, they think of her killing her children.
Yeah.
But that was most likely an invention by
What's the
Euripides.
joke? You fuck one goat. You're,
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Sleep with your mother once. No, and but you know, but it's interesting to think that like if Medea was known to people before Euripides, like those centuries of writers and poets, I shouldn't say writers because most of them were composing orally, but
yeah.
that would never have been part of her persona, you know, that thing that we most know her for that would not have occurred to most ancient Greeks before Euripides. And that's just, and I think that is so good to kind of dismantle these rather stale ideas of like what is the tradition and that it's unchanging. And I love that you quoted what you quoted. It's a mind that changes and that this
Yeah.
change development which abandons nothing. That's really the heart of it for me is that like I think people mispresent tradition as something stable and it's
Yeah.
actually
Oh, yeah.
we should relish it how it
And
changed.
that, I mean, I think the Borges highlighted as well that part of the effect, if not the work of an individual writer, is to rescript the canon,
Mhm.
right? Like if you write something significant and it is influenced by some work that is otherwise obscure or forgotten or outside the canon, then that becomes part of that tradition. Like you are creating a new tradition which just incorporates more new strange threads that that might not have been in the tradition, might not have been on the syllabus a semester ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really love Jericho Brown's recent book, The Tradition.
Oh
And
yeah, what I don't, and this I haven't read it. What's the story?
yeah, well, he plays with,
Because
well,
it's a poetry
he
collection, right?
invented, with what?
It's a poetry collection, right?
Yeah, it's a poetry collection. And I mean, he's very much consciously, he calls it the tradition with like
Mm-hmm.
the prefix, the article there signifying singularity.
Yeah.
And in fact, the whole book is about multiplying and pluralizing what could be traditions. And he invents the form. Have you read these called the duplex?
No,
Um,
no, no. What is this?
oh, it's a really cool, and people have been exploding writing them
Okay.
since he created this form. There's a really great essay available on the Poetry Foundation website after he won the Pulitzer, and he invents the duplex, which he calls he names it that because it felt like a house with two addresses, which I love. That he called that. That's like his chosen title
Oh,
for the
yeah,
form.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
And but he kind of used both a ghazal and a sonnet
Okay.
to base it on. So there's a really great essay, and he's like, a young Black poet. Students love reading his work. They find it like exciting, but I also like he's a really great poet to teach in terms of someone young, gay, Black who like wants to engage with
Yeah.
the tradition and make it his own. And and I think students then, so like we read Jericho Brown, the same class we read Eliot, and there was this one thing Jericho Brown says, I should remind everyone I know, or sorry, I should remind everyone who knows me that I do not believe poems are made of our beliefs. Instead, I believe poems lead us to and tell us what we really believe, which really echoes Eliot and that whole kind of
Yeah.
definition of personality. I think poems, working with language and seeing where it may lead us, seeing what kinds of choices we make when we have to find a rhyme or syllable, tell us about our individual and collective subconscious minds. I write in forms because formal work helps to push me towards saying what I couldn't imagine I would say in poems. And that's kind of a moment where they're like, oh, now I can agree a little bit more with Eliot because like it
Right.
really is funny,
Yeah.
like the tide against Eliot turned a little bit
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He
faster.
rewrites Eliot in order to make
Yeah,
him, yeah, it
yeah,
was wrong the first time he said it. Now it's right that, yeah. Just
exactly.
so people, because you mentioned it, and it looks quite short. I'll read this, the poem Duplex, which I'm assuming is the first one.
I
Um,
can't remember what order they're in the book, but in the essay, yeah, he includes a couple duplexes, and it's a really intricate repetition form.
yeah, here it's, this one's, I don't know where in the process this occurred, but this is just called Duplex by Jericho Brown. A poem is a gesture toward home. It makes dark demands I call my own. Memory makes demands darker than my own. My last love drove a burgundy car. My first love drove a burgundy car. He was fast and awful, tall as my father, steadfast and awful, my tall father, hit hard as a hailstone. He'd leave marks. Light rain hits easy but leaves its own mark, like the sound of a mother weeping again, like the sound of my mother weeping again. No sound beating ends where it began. None of the beaten end up how we began. The poem is a gesture toward home. It almost sounds like the like a more a less insane version of that made up Provençal form,
Of Billy
the
Collins.
Paradelle. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
No, I have to spend some time with that because that you're right. Yeah, that's like a Sistina Triolet kind of monster.
exactly. Yeah, and he also says, the blues and repetition of the blues influenced
Mhm.
it. So
And
yeah,
yeah, I mean, you said the
I
guzzle, obviously. Yeah,
yeah. So it's great, and I mean, there have been poets writing now their own duplexes, which is, and I ask my students to write duplex. So it feels like if you can make like we've been talking about how the tradition changes, the mind changes. If you can feel like they're part of that change, I think that it helps them understand it a bit more versus like
yeah,
well, that was then and this is now, and now
right.
we're back on the syllabus, right? Like you have to
Yeah,
imbibe all this. But to show them the duplex and to have them write one and to have them write one and be like, oh, this is hard, you know? um,
yeah,
uh, the new form is still hard. Which is,
yeah. Oh, I mean, and I was gonna say, I like in a way, like I don't know, I can't identify everything that's happening here, but I like in a way the rigor of this one. In part, it feels like a like I have one of my pet peeves has been like the overabundance of sloppy guzzles. I feel like people feel like they're kind of easy to write, especially if you ignore the fucking rules, and then and then you just get this proliferation of like repeating couplet poems, and you're like, God damn it, like please,
Yeah.
let's try something a little bit tougher.
Although
Yeah, I
I'd
like
say that it's a good exercise for students because it makes because it doesn't feel as hardcore formal as, okay, here's write a Shakespearean sonnet and iambic pentameter, but it does make them reckon with repetition in a way that I think is helpful. So even if like published guzzles as Americans understand them, which is totally different than what
Yeah,
they
like improvisatory guzzles, which I mean, as I understand it, were sort of emerged as like a very rigorous form of like a battle rap.
Yeah. And the way, I can't remember the name I'm thinking of right now. There was an essay about ghazals and their like kind of original like medieval Persian form. And the reason that one of the rules we understand a ghazal to have is that the final couplet or tercet includes the poet's name,
Yeah.
is because it was it was orally delivered in an audience, and it was almost like an oral signature to the poem. Like if someone's listening in a crowd to this poem and by this poet,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
poet
yeah.
proclaims their name in the final end, and they can be like, oh, now I know who said that. Like if I
Yeah,
didn't know
yeah,
who
yeah,
the poet
yeah.
was, now I
It's
know.
a nice way to say like, all right, I'm done, but
Yeah.
also like
Yeah.
check out my website, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's kind of like saying your name into the mic before you drop it, but part of the
Yeah.
performance. Yeah. So, and when
Yeah,
they realize that, they're like, oh, well, then it doesn't seem like a kind of a uselessly random rule, then it's like it has this like real meaning. Yeah.
which is so frustrating. Like, about poetry units, as they're called, is that you learn some of the forms and rules, but you seldom learn like, oh, these are here to do things.
Right.
They're here in order to have effects. They're not just here to be here and be rules.
Yeah. Just to make life hard for you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because it coming back to even it's the second part of the Eliot essay where he, as you said, he uses the image of a finely filiated platinum. A bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. He refers to the poet basically as a kind of an inert catalyst who, in the presence of the tradition, creates this new possibility. I always have mixed feelings about that image, but the big claims of this piece, I mean, certainly like the most famous articulation of his claim is: poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. And my thought is, every time I've read that, it's been like, God, that sounds so good, but is it true? Like, what? So
Yeah.
yeah, like if he's very insistent that poetry is not, that good poetry really should be impersonal, it should be an escape from the personal. He also refers to emotions versus feelings. I still have no idea what the difference is supposed to be. Could you clarify any of this for me?
I mean, from what I think I understand, or what it makes me think about is, well, for example, if in my intro classes, if I say to students like, what is poetry, like what makes it special as a genre versus like fiction or essays, they'll be like, oh, like almost all the time, well, poetry is about emotion.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then that's when I sort of start to roll up my sleeves and be like, we will, I hope you will change your answer by the end of the semester, because it's actually about language. It's not and I mean, and I don't, but they want to come to it expressing their emotions. They feel like this is this special elevated place where they can say how they feel. And what I think this essay is trying to show us is that, sure, you come to it with that, but it's the fact that you've been reading and you've been immersing yourself in different authors, different forms, different stories that tell a range of like experiences and emotion through a range of musicality, rhythm, repetition, all those special elements of that, kind of make poetic language more distinct. That then what starts as like emotion, I'm sad because my boyfriend broke up with
yeah.
me. I'm sad because my girlfriend broke up with me. Um, then can become more of an introspective experience, not just for yourself, but also for any readers. And it sort of transmutes it so that it's not just about you, but it invites other people in through, and so that they also, because the quote you read is so good, like, but you have to know, you have to have personality and emotions to know what it is to escape from them. And that, I think, is something that a lot of younger writers, they're not ready for that yet. Like they need to read more and live more a little bit before they can fully drink that down. I
Yeah,
I
like
like
that they haven't lived long enough to have experienced the difference between weather and climate. Like it's they're still sort of it's hard to distinguish themselves or like human experience from the particular storm they're living inside of at this moment.
I like also to think about Pound's like image, thought, and music. You know, that those are all like
Yeah,
necessary in a way.
elaborate on that if you would.
I think it's in the ABC of reading. I'd have to double check, but he talks about three elements of poetry. He calls them like melopoeia, the poetry of music, logopoeia, the poetry of thinking, and then phanopoeia, the poetry of imagery. So I would say that most good poems have those three things going on, like
Yeah.
image, thought, and music. Maybe not all of them, but I think a lot of them do. And so it feels like emotion or feeling happens through each of those in different ways. And I think so I think that's also part of what Eliot can still teach us, that emotion is not just pure raw emotion, but it's learning how to channel it through image, thought, music, to take those ideas from Pound.
I,
Um,
I want, yeah, reading this, I thought sometimes that it was almost like he had this thing to offer, but it was almost like he was bad at advertising it.
oh yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
is not in his personal emotions, the emotions provoked by particular events in his life, that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting. Like that's just a really good way to put people off.
off.
But
Oh no,
but
and
I think
yeah.
like a way to approach this that again is would be far less erudite or well put than Eliot does it would be not to say you're wrong to want to express your feelings or you're wrong to think this poem is about you, but rather to say that like you, as you said, like your desire, your these strong feelings move, draw you toward certain poems and maybe even push you toward writing. But when you begin to immerse yourself in the work of actually trying to write, new things emerge and it becomes possible. It's not that you have a duty or a moral responsibility to leave your to abandon your emotions, but rather that in actually trying to set words down, you discover something that might lie beyond them. You might not be trapped in your emotions. I was reading the slush pile the other night, and I read this poet, and I thought it is always really depressing to me when I read a poet and think like, oh, this guy seems really young. And I look him up and he's like 65. I'm like, God damn it. Like, why are you a professor or something? But like I read this poet and I think he was relatively young, but it it wasn't that his poems they were perfectly well written and he was clearly well educated and there was fine, suitable subject matter, but the way in which he was putting words together, it felt almost like he hadn't bothered to speak. It was like he was speaking one of those twin languages, but only to himself,
Mm.
which to me, like, I feel like is part of like, it's an early phase of development for a lot of poets. Certainly was for me, where
Yep.
you're putting together words in a way that sounds good to you. And you know, like, I guess the way I think of it is like in a, the key to any poem is that you have to be a human being for all of it to make sense. Like a poem doesn't exist. Poetry wouldn't exist in an unmanned universe, right? Like you need a human perspective. But the problem is when you have you have to be not just a human being, but this particular human being in order for it to make sense. Like you have to be the guy who wrote it in order for all of these parts to come together. And part of maturing as a poet is beginning to realize that you need to write in a way that allows other people in rather than shutting them all out.
Yeah. Because so often, like in a workshop scenario, maybe something points out like, well, I don't understand this. And then the poet might say, like, well, I know what it means.
Yeah, good. That's fine. Don't publish it. Yeah.
But no, something in the Eliot essay that I really like, that kind of echoes what you were just saying is he says, it is not in his personal emotions, the emotions provoked by particular events in his life, that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting. His particular emotions may be simple or crude or flat. The emotion in his poetry will be a very complex thing, but not with the complexity of the emotions of people who have very complex or unusual emotions in life. One error, in fact, of eccentricity in poetry is to seek new human emotions to express. And in this search for novelty in the wrong place, it discovers the perverse, which is really, like, that's another moment where, it feels like you were saying some of these things just feel so contemporary, like some poems you read, you're like, oh, did the person just write this to be the weirdest, strangest, most shocking, surprising thing,
Right. I mean, it's like there was a spate for a while of nonfiction books that were like half expose, half memoir, where you'd have like basically the author just like did a crazy stunt. Like there was a book I remember, I didn't read it, but it was like a guy lived a whole year following all of the 613 rules in Leviticus to the letter. And like, I mean, presumably he didn't actually do that because he would have gone to prison if he'd done that. But like it was like he was living according to the Bible and then kind of writing up what that was like. But it felt like there was a series of these books where it just felt like, oh, you just did a crazy thing to yourself in order to have a crazy thing to write about.
Right. Yeah.
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 And lyric poetry can feel like sometimes, a milder version of that.
True. And so the idea is not, like, as Eliot says, he says, the business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones, and in working them up into poetry to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. Now, and that's part of the point where it's like, well, okay, what is this difference between feeling and emotion? Like, is it feeling more intellectual than a pure emotion? Is feeling more like a more complex collection of image, thought, music, that versus like I'm sad or I'm angry? I don't and like you say, he is just there are parts where you almost want to hand it to John Draper to like
Right, yeah.
advertise, can you help us with this?
Yeah, like this is actually, there is a thing to find here,
Yeah.
but boy, Elliot's presenting it in a way that makes it seem
Yeah.
like, yeah, like
Ori,
nothing
yeah.
to do with it. Yeah. I mean, it also just, it feel like I mean, you get the impression looking at photos of him and listening to recordings, like he was the kind of guy who, like, even when he was trying to, it's like there was an old Kids in the Hall sketch where the character has a medical condition where he can only speak in a sarcastic voice. And the last line of the scene is, "I'm so lonely." But Elliot has a little bit of that, like he can only speak in a way that sounds like he's talking down his nose at you.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
which in his poetry, I mean, I've loved his poetry since I first
Yeah,
read
of course.
it,
Yeah.
I mean, I had most of Proofrock memorized and would
Yeah.
my roommates' annoyances like recited often.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the poetry, and I think the people, I mean, I'm still teaching the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock in my intro class, and students still connect with it when they find out they wrote it when he was 24. The obverse, actually, of what you just said about the slush pile poem that felt like a poet, like a young poet, but he's 65.
Yeah.
The fact that he wrote Prufrock when he was like 24, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, he was in college, I think.
Crazy. It's just
Right.
crazy. So that might have something to teach too about what, and that obviously it's a persona poem, but it feels like it's distilled something so deep to human loneliness and feeling excluded
Mhm.
that
And it feels, I mean, that's the thing, is like it feels extremely personal, but also it wouldn't be as good as it is if it didn't transcend the immediate experience of the kid who wrote it.
right. Yeah, the kid, exactly.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
I've been loving Louise Gluck's Proofs and Theories essays on poetry,
Oh yeah, I read that a couple of years ago. Yeah.
and the first time I read it, I think maybe over 10 years ago, I didn't it didn't electrify me, but for some reason now, I don't know if it's just because she's dead. That would be an unfair reason to really love a book.
Mhm.
But
My impression was like it had a lot of really smart pronouncements, but they were put in a really dry and slightly alienating way.
so funnily enough, a little bit like tradition and the individual
Yeah,
talent.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but she talks about Eliot in it, and she talks about like it's in her essay, Invitation and Exclusion. And she says that she always feels invited by Eliot's poetry and that she feels her presence essential to the poems in ways that like with poets like Stevens, like she doesn't. So it's
Yeah.
just, it's an interesting difference. But the thing I wanted to say about, it reminded me, you said about like, I'm so lonely. And she's talking about Prufrock here. She says, I'm talking about what Prufrock can't do. The figure adrift may not be Eliot, but he locates Eliot's concerns. This is a poem infused with yearning, as is nearly all Eliot's work. Even his famous passion for tradition manifests. In another way, a longing for completion, for linking, for correspondence. He locates himself in relation to, which I thought was like a really beautiful way to think about tradition and individual talent as like a longing for completion, for linking, for correspondence. I don't
Yeah.
know.
And there's a like one of the refrains of the last, decade or so, in just like contemporary American life, particularly in sort of university and art circles, is check your privilege. And among the different things that it suggests is that it is actually a worthwhile exercise to stop and reconsider your worldview, and that it's possible that the way you have been looking at things has inappropriately placed yourself at the center, or has neglected to identify it's not just about feeling bad about yourself, it's about more accurately identifying your relationships to other people. And the way I think of like the Buddhist idea of dukkha, that you like part of the way you damage a wheel is by putting the axle slightly off center.
Mm.
And if you actually get it in the right place, then things move more smoothly. I think similarly with a poem, like I read there was a poem that had a little bit of viral juice several months ago called "Motherhood" by Cecily Parks. I can never remember. That was like it's clearly like a powerful poem. There's a lot of really evocative stuff in it, and it's about a woman who has a slightly misguided and misplaced affair when she's younger, and then she thinks about as a woman you're born with all the eggs you'll have, and so she the children that she now has were in some way present in her body at the time she had this affair when she was younger. Like it's a memorable poem. It stuck with me, but it also like part of what nagged at me about it was that it seemed slightly too lost in itself, that it did seemed in a
Mm.
way like too personal. It wasn't that I wanted her to be writing about world affairs and international, like I didn't want her to write about a less personal thing, but it felt as if she had not quite ventured outside of the closed off blinders of
Mhm.
her own perspective. And I find that when I'm writing, some of the poems that are sort of most inspired by powerful feeling, it is not until I can kind of step back and acknowledge realities outside of what feels gratifying to me in that moment that the poem can really mature.
Mhm.
And I thought about like you talked in your essay "The Old and the New" about one of the ways. There, of course, there are many different ways to fail and succeed, but one of the ways in which revisionist or revisionary literature can fail is by being too tendentious. If you
Mhm.
come in, you talked about the what was the Margaret Atwood piece that I hadn't read it.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, would you
the
say a word
Penelope.
about that if you would?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I love Margaret Atwood's Circe mud poems. From those are from a 1970s collection. You Are Happy. They're so great, and they seem very revisionary in spirit to me. But her 2005 book Penelopiad, whew, it is a
Mhm.
it's a prosometrum. Like it is mostly prose, but she has these kind of lyric interludes, sometimes by the maidservants at the house who Odysseus tells Telemachus when he comes home, and he's after he's slaughtered the suitors, he tells Telemachus to hang them, which is one of the I mean, the Odyssey is full of these
horrifying, yeah.
cruel, horrifying things, and but because they've been adulterous with the suitors and thus disloyal to the house, they have to die. So Atwood, and I think this is actually one of the coolest things about the book, is she has them kind of as like a Greek chorus come in a little bit and give commentary. But overall, the spirit is just like, let's talk about everything that's wrong with the Odyssey. And like, it was kind of it's a kind of like hyper feminist critical lens on it. And it just was like quite boring, I have to say. I mean, honestly, like, I mean, I love like her books, but I was surprised when I was reading it. Like, I just put it down. I just was like uninteresting, except for that kind of invention of the choral slaughtered maidservants, but not enough.
Do you know the it's only now occurring to me the link, but there's a Haney poem about one of those like super preserved corpses and excavated from a bog.
Yeah.
And it's specifically like it's a young girl who they were saying she had all her hair cut off and she was sacrificed or put into the bog, by her people hundreds, thousands of years ago. But he links it to the treatment of the women who slept with the Ulstermen in Ireland, like basically, which is, I mean, it's a dark but long tradition of like horizontal collaborators, or after the conflict, the women who slept with the enemy are in like a traditional punishment is their heads are shaved and they're marched through the town. But he links those two together in a way that, at least, it's been a while since I read it, but my recollection is that it's extremely affecting, but he sort of abstains from making pronouncements about it. He just sort of sets it in front of us. And we don't need him to tell us that it's fucked up.
Right. Exactly. And I think that's, I mean, and that's such a great example of what Borges is talking about. Like, it takes Heaney to connect, the punishment of the women who slept with Ulstermen with this bog, preserved body in a bog, with the hair shorn off as a sign of shame. Amazing. And as you say, like, and the revisionist spirit might be too much like, and this is why it's terrible. And, I think just to let it settle between itself is enough, more than enough.
I mean, it's thinking about it in the Borgesian sense, that part of your job is not just to say the thing that you want to say, but to provide. It's almost like, I mean, I think you are in some sense providing a link or a connection or a little bridge, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of those who come after. Because it occurred to me that there is, he talks a lot in this essay about the present moment in criticism, which of course sounds a lot like our own, in its sort of contempt for the past. And I think that this is, we are living in a moment where there's a very strong sense that we need to revise the past, and that the past is sort of has an oppressive hold on us. And of course, there's a whole lot of truth to that. But it occurred to me only in reading this essay again, that in having contempt for the past, we do in some sense have contempt for the future, because we are assuming that the role of our moment is to offer a corrective rather than to offer a bridge.
I love how you put that. And I'd also say that the contempt falls back on ourselves as well, even subconsciously, that if we imagine ourselves to be complicit somehow with these past wrongs, it really hinders an imaginative approach to the future, and the present too. And absolutely, as you were saying, like, think about your worldview, let's like question things, but let's, also, we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, to use an overused phrase. Like,
right. And I think, like, just as one of the refrains on this podcast is that a lot of writers tend to go astray when they veer from the descriptive into the prescriptive. I think reading Eliot, I was reminded that it is helpful also to try to read descriptively rather than prescriptively. Like, even when somebody like Eliot is wagging a finger and telling you this is what you should do, I try to remember to read, like, not just to say like, well, that's wrong, but to say like, is there a way in which that could have truth to it? Like, is there a way in which he could be describing something of value, setting aside his tone about it, setting aside like his attitude toward it? Is he describing something? And that, like, that's my feeling with criticism, is like, I'm much less interested in you know extracting verdicts than I am in identifying possibilities. Like, oh, that's a way to read. That's
Yeah,
a way to write.
yeah. And one of the paradoxes for me of revisionary poetry is um, that, say you have a poet like Carolyn Duffy who writes in the voice of
Yeah.
Eurydice, and in doing so, nicely kind of lays out narratives that have privileged like the male, like the poet as a man, and a
Mm-hmm.
kind of female subservience to either being the one who inspires or the one who helps, deliver his poem. And so I love Caroline Duffy's poem Eurydice, but it's interesting that like a lot of revisionary poems, if a contemporary reader who say isn't familiar as much with Orpheus and Eurydice myth, they read that poem Eurydice and they recognize contemporary impulses in it,
Yeah.
like the feminist approach and the playfulness, along with like a beautiful use of rhyme in that poem and musicality. And then they go back though. So it's interesting, like even though revisionary poetry points us towards what could be more contemporary criticisms, it also then that reader might go, well, what was it in the past? And they might go back and read Ovid, they might go back and read Virgil. So it's interesting. I think and I appreciate the paradox that um, rather than erasing uh, past authors or more canonical texts, the revisionary mode kind of slyly, even sometimes subversively to its own authors, will send readers back to those ancient texts,
Yeah.
which the current poem is trying to say, well, there's something lacking there. There's something like wrong there. So, and I
Yeah.
think, I don't know, it's just an interesting snaking in its tail kind of a thing
No,
that
yeah.
that I appreciate about it. And I feel like it does have something in the spirit Eliot's talking about in his essay, and maybe even something that would surprise someone who might be having too much of a prescriptive rather than descriptive approach
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
reading or writing. That all of these things should really exist together, and that even if a revisionary poem is correcting, it still is in a way an homage to the original because it would never have existed without it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. There's. It's funny. I was thinking about Alain Botton has some smart writing about the tragic, the impulse to write tragedy, and my older daughter is reading the. Do you know? I don't know if you have boys or girls.
I have two boys, 7 and 5.
Okay. All right. I was
Yeah.
gonna say, so it's some different, slightly different canon. Overlapping, but maybe divergent. But my daughter just blew through the School for Good and Evil books, which are books that are kind of it's like Harry Potter for Grimm's fairy tales, kind of like they're all these characters from European fairy tales, and there's a lot of the revisionist impulse to say like, aha, but these were very patriarchal, or aha, but these were homophobic, or aha, but and
Right.
that's again, like, not wrong, but it does occur to me that there's a slight difference between the impulse to say like, hey, what happened in that, what that guy did, the result of that story or the verdict placed on that result was fucked up,
Yeah.
versus what at least the baton identifies as the impulse to write tragedy, which is to say like, hey, that thing that happened that was really fucked up, is there a way that could make sense? And like that's the thing, with
Yeah.
Oedipus or with Medea, like, you start, the place you begin is with the unthinkable act,
Yeah.
and then you work backwards to say like, how could you get there in a way that was understandable?
Yeah, especially the choral odes in Aeschylus's Agamemnon are some of my favorite instances of just that. I mean,
Yeah,
those
yeah.
just like you read them, you're like, holy shit, how have we sunk into like the depths of human joy and sorrow through this horrible story? But it's the
Oh
horrible
yeah.
story that lets you get there.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, and that is a I mean, it makes me wonder actually how I wonder if the way it makes me like, I want to sometime be able to like re-experience that play in slightly more the way they did at the time, because I think reading it today, it's very difficult. This is the play Agamemnon, which the grand field marshal, as Fitzgerald calls him, of the Greeks, comes back home after the Trojan War, having at the very beginning of the war sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia in order to get the winds to blow, and he comes back home to his wife Clytemnestra, who has been waiting for him with an axe for 10 years, and at the end of the play, or the climax of the play, she hacks him to pieces in the bathtub, and uh this is like the description of like the arterial spray as being like the fresh spring rain falling down over the
Yes,
field. So she's
yes,
just,
it was
you have
immediately.
this tableau where she's just soaked in blood holding the weapon, and it's horrifying, but it's also very cathartic. And like reading it today, it's very hard not to read it as like, well, this was like he had this coming. And I imagined that at the time it probably was more horrifying in an odd way. And it might have been similar to the way that like we read Orestes killing Clytemnestra at the end of the libation bearers today, where like when he is driven by the god Apollo to kill his own mother, to avenge his father's death, that might stir more feelings of horror in us than like my guess is there might have been a little bit of a tipping of the scales back then, that they might have thought it more horrifying when Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon, and maybe slightly less horrifying than we do when Orestes kills Clytemnestra. I don't know. You're the classicist. Tell me what. Yeah.
Oh, half assist, but no, I think you're right. I mean, what part of the continued vocalized shock of Agamemnon is that a woman's doing this,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the one who steals the show in Agamemnon is Cassandra, and she's
Yeah.
telling the chorus like, beware, like the cow will kill the bull, and she like
Yeah.
the reversal of traditional gender roles of like the when man is the one who kills and the woman would not. That's part
Yeah.
of the shock of it. But I think, it's so well balanced by the shock of father killing daughter, which none of this happens on stage, but the chorus evokes that moment for us at the very beginning where they're giving a necessary background, I think, to the audience. Like, remember this happened?
Yeah.
Remember he killed Iphigenia, and
Yeah.
remember that. And the way they say it is like, that he carried her like a goat to the slaughter, to the altar. He gagged her so she couldn't breathe a curse out. But the poet says that she shot arrows from her eyes at the people watching, which is just amazing. So yeah, I think that there is the ways that we're asked to empathize with Clytemnestra and also be repulsed by her are amazing in that play. And again, there's like no easy answer. But I think when Orestes kills Clytemnestra, he does say to Pylades, he's like, how can I do it? Like, he's come to the moment, he's ready, she's unarmed, he's about to do it, and he stops and he says, to Pylades, how can I do it? Right after.
Is it in the play, or is it in some other version where she like bears her breast to him to say like, you
That's
fed here?
yeah, no, that's in the Aeschylus. And that's actually, I think, patterned off in book 20, 22 of the Iliad, before Hector's going to go fight Achilles. Hecuba tries to persuade him not to go, and she like bears her breast. So
Yeah.
it's such it's another and again, like, revisionary, like, it's so interesting, like she's bearing her breast to save her son's life, and Clytemnestra is like the inverse wicked mother, and she's bearing her breast to guilt trip him not to kill her, which is so fascinating.
What is it? You might actually know this. The in Hamlet, when the traveling players come to Elsinore, and these are modeled to some extent on troops at the time, and they would have had just enormous quantities of verse and verse dramas and adaptations of verse dramas all in their heads and kind of ready to perform at the drop of a hat. And Hamlet remembers one of them giving a speech about the Pyrrhus, the Achilles' son, killing
Oh,
Priam,
I
and
am. Yeah.
it's a horrifying scene. But then there's a moment in there, and unless I'm misremembering, where it could read as like horrible, like horror slapstick, where
Mm,
there's a mention of Hecuba, who's had like 50 sons. It's like some insane, but
yeah.
I mean, it's basically, it's like her like or whatever you call it, perineal floor. Like there's some prolapse basically. Like she's like physically falling apart, and it's both and like this moment of horror in response to Priam's being killed, but also it's like the burden of all of these, this enormous number of children that she's born who have also then just are being slaughtered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't remember. I don't remember. And I also like, what is that from? Like Hamlet is quote, like the guy is quoting it in the play, and Hamlet's quoting it, and it's from some version of something. But
well, I mean, Virgil's Aeneid tells the fall of Troy, and it has that
yeah.
gruesome scene where
Oh, okay. All right. That's in Virgil. All right. Yeah.
where Pyrrhus kills Priam, and it's just awful. It's just because like the
Yeah.
relationship between Priam and Achilles is one of the the most saving grace moments in
Oh
all
God.
literature.
Yeah.
And then
Oh,
to have his
absolutely. Yeah.
son kill him in such a disrespectful way, it's like, the good old days are gone. Yeah, it's just
Right. Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah, I can't think exactly of the speech you're talking about. But then I also love how Hecuba becomes a dog in Ovid, and also but previously in Euripides.
Oh, yeah. I have not read of it. So yeah. Yeah. I didn't
Yeah,
know
in the
that.
Metamorphoses, she actually, once her last son she thought was alive, uh, she finds out he's dead. She kills his murderer, but in her rage, like she actually transforms into a dog, and that's implied in Euripides, and then centuries later, Ovid kind of in his Metamorphoses like makes it more an actual transformation, and then Anne Carson had a recent graphic novel of the Trojan women, which is
Oh.
great. Like Helen's
Oh
like
my
a
God. That sounds like Trojan
yeah.
Women is just it's about as bleak as it gets.
Look around and see if it's because Hecuba is the old dog, and when you were talking about like her body and that like the uterine prolapse,
Yeah.
I think that animalized, aged maternal body easily maps on to like this idea of like the old weary widowed yeah, in really sad awful ways that are hard to articulate, but yeah, but then like the graphic novel, I forget the artist who designed it or did the illustrations right now, but yeah, Anne Carson did a very much an updated version, using commercial language like we've done a little bit actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and then but Helen's like a sexy dog in high heels.
Wait,
Heck,
they're all dogs?
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Ah, okay.
yeah. Sometimes
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
That's
my son saw the cover and he's like, "Why is that lady a dog?" And I was like, "Well, she got very angry, and that was the only thing that she could do then was become a dog."
yeah.
Although they there's a great podcast for kids on mythology, Greeking Out, and they love it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
like National Geographic does it. And
Oh,
after,
wow.
yeah, my son listened to the ones about the Trojan War, and he's 7. So I hear him talking like he was like sad Patroclus died, and I was like, oh no, it's like
Yeah.
fresh weeping.
Oh, yeah. No, good. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, who was I? I was just talking to Victoria Mole, who does the Horace and Friends Substack, and
Oh
uh,
yeah, oh she's great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And she's got 3 sons, and she has a great piece about poetry for children and just sort of the like she talks about this tradition of like weird sort of like semi paraphrased, semi summarizing literature for kids that like somewhat obliquely introduces them to all these old myths so that I mean, like my experience growing up was that my dad would get tired of my asking him to tell a story at bedtime, so he would just start paraphrasing stuff he'd read. And so I would end up like I remember in high school reading Heart of Darkness and being like, wait, I've heard this before.
Yeah, oh that's
But
so
yeah,
good.
you get these sort of shards of story, and in a way, like I think that's sort of the truer way to experience it, is that like, yeah, there are individual pieces of writing by individual writers, but also this stuff just is like is part of the air.
Yeah,
Like you inherit it and you breathe it in, and it's like I don't even remember the first time you heard this story.
yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite moments in Plato, when he's talking about like kicking the poets out in the Republic, he also
Yeah.
mentions nursemaids and mothers, because like he's like, and
Oh, I forgot about
you have
that.
to make sure that they're also telling the right stories, because a lot of the
Right,
ways
right.
that the kids get this stuff is at bedtime. And it's just
Yeah.
like, yeah, and it's such a great tiny moment, but it speaks to such a hugely subterranean, subconscious way that these stories get passed down.
Yeah. And it also it once again gives the lie to contemporary poets who like to brag about getting kicked out of the
Right.
Republic. I want to say like, no, 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 no. Plato's talking about influential storytelling, like people who are actually listened to, who like tell things in an appealing, immersive way. You know,
But
he's not
Aeschylus.
talking about like you and your experimental crown of sonnets. You know,
Yes.
yeah. So I don't want to get you into trouble, but I did, reading your piece, The Old and the New, it it seemed to me that you had a little bit of a like a delicately Janus-like quality to the essay, that you sort of you identify in the beginning and the end a one of the themes that the New Criterion likes to hammer, which is, hey, isn't it so crazy when people get mad about the classics being old white guys? And like there is a lot of dumb overreaction and dumb like attempt to Baudelarize the tradition, by saying, hey, let's, you know, Shakespeare's just a white guy, like, or Homer's just a white guy. Like calling Homer a white guy is again like a kind of a weird
Right.
thing, but like that is, yes, that is dumb, and yes, that is like unhelpful. But it seemed to me that you were sort of, you kind of brought up this question in a way that was both an, it was sort of a double vindication. It was like it was an invitation to people who were already committed to traditional literature, and it was an invitation to people who want a fresher, more inclusive contemporary lens on literature. That you were, it would, in a way, it was like it depended on depending on who you were reading, who you were when you read it. It was like, oh yeah, I'm speaking to you. So just, yeah, I thought that was sort of quietly skillful. You know, I don't know if that's like a Solomonic or like a maternal diplomacy.
Well, thank you. I think that's what I wanted in a way when I was, and I think if I do go on to turn it into a book where I can read a lot more of these poems from antiquity and also contemporary poets, that's, I think that's a Janus-like quality I'd like to maintain. Like there's like, I don't want to be preaching to the choir. I want to be bringing new people in as well, to the, I'm not going to take that church metaphor any further, but um, uh,
Yeah.
but I do want, because I think that one of the dangers of always defending the tradition is that you lose a sense of what that is, and a sense
Right.
of,
Yeah.
as we've been talking about, that it changes. It's not this stable, monolithic,
Yeah.
self-sanctioning thing, that it's actually always changing. And that's something that I felt, I think, a lot. You know, I studied classics in college and also during my doctorate, and a lot of the classicists I've been most drawn to have had that attitude, but that attitude is only understood against the old model where everything is like, as I said before, like this is the syllabus, like this is the
Yeah.
syllabus has been the same for 2000 years, and this is what we're doing. So I think that I'm used to conversing with both kinds of classical scholars. And you know, there's much to be gained from like the old model too. Like there, it's, you know,
Yeah.
a lot of great conversations to be had. So I do want it to have a kind of sense of like, if you think you know it, you don't, and if you don't think you want to know it, you might. I
Yeah.
think that's kind of what I would like to continue with it. So thanks for saying it. It means a lot that you read it
Oh
that
yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean it reminds me a little bit of, you know, my wife is a doctor, and like part of her frustration in hearing criticisms of Western medicine is that like, well, like, are there limitations to Western medicine? Yeah, but again, like what Western medicine actually is like medicine that we can prove works. So like if your like mushroom treatment works, great, it gets to be part of Western med. Like, please welcome in. We want more things that work.
Right.
And I think similarly with the tradition, like it is a mistake to defend it too vigorously, is to forget that like it should, setting aside what is the West. There's a pretty good. I don't know if you know ContraPoints, but she has a pretty good essay or video essay about like the West is not a useful concept. But like to setting that aside, like what's definitely true of any of the writers who make up this tradition is that they would want, like, they are interested in more good stories, in more good, like, they're not interested in being safeguarded and kept,
Right.
segregated from new things or from things from other, like they would, they love stories, they will love beauty, they love language.
I hope they do. Most of them.
I mean, it seems like I mean, sometimes despite themselves, again, like sometimes, people have remarked on it plenty of times, but I think you do see in Eliot that there's a productive tension between his criticism and his poetry.
Yeah. And I'd say, I mean, I think that maybe what drew me to the more classical receptions model is that I did witness people who felt like they were guardians at the gate of classics,
Yeah.
and like you had to show yourself worthy to be let in. And I started studying the classics because my great grandmother was an amazing woman, and she was a Latin teacher in rural Ohio, and she had 8 children, and after her husband died rather young of a heart attack, she went back and started teaching Latin again in the schools to keep the money coming in.
Yeah.
And so like growing up, like she would talk about Virgil and Augustine, and I started learning Latin in high school like because of her. And she had that education at a time when it was rare that women would learn Latin in the early 20th century. I really shouldn't have her dates in my mind more than I do. We were talking about earlier about the absent-minded professor, like that's a running joke with my students. Like I'm always like,
Yeah.
and it's this century. Like it's just,
Yeah.
but then when I went and studied classics, like I did encounter those more stale, hierarchical attitudes, and I was like, well, that's not what I want it to be, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. There's a note that I think can be read as exclusionary, but I think it is really the opposite in the Eliot piece where he says, like my refrain tends to be that if you speak the language, then the literature belongs to you. But he says the tradition cannot be inherited. It must be earned. And the emphasis when he's stating it seems to be on, hey, you need to do lots of hard work and study and, but what he is saying, particularly coming, writing, he's an American, but he's writing from England, runs against the grain of the class tradition there, which is that if for something to be inherited, means you
Yes.
have to be born into the right family to get it. Like you're born and you're landed and that belongs to you. And you can't earn that kind of status. You have to be born into it. What he's saying is much more egalitarian, saying like, well, it's impossible to inherit it. Anybody who works for it gets to have it.
Well said. Here. It
Yeah.
reminds me of one of my favorite moments in The Office, the British
Oh
series,
yeah, 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 yeah.
where Tim walks in, his last name is Canterbury, and David Brent, the boss, who I mean was not in any way like landed or elite, but like maybe
No.
subconsciously kind of got that like, oh, I can name check stuff and I can
Yeah,
show the
yeah, yeah.
culture. Like he walks in, he's like Tim Canterbury, and then he looks at the camera, he's like Chaucer,
Right.
Shakespeare.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No,
But
these are
that's
some names that I vaguely
yeah,
associate
some
with,
names.
yeah,
Yeah.
fanciness. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. Is terrific. I really appreciate you
Yeah,
being
really great to
such a
talk with
great,
you.
great support for this. Yeah, I don't know if you have listened to anything in the podcast in the past, but if there are obvious things that we've gotten wrong or obvious things that come to mind or that you quarrel with, please, I always want to hear, new revisions or, chime in.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Yeah,
I can't
good.
think of anything that I was, particularly aggrieved by right now.
Yeah. I got a note from Chris Childers. It was very sweet, but he was like, yes, at some point we should discuss the things you've said about the classics. Like,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, like, all right, I'm sure I've gotten a lot wrong. Oh,
Oh,
well.
well, I mean, but I think that's part of the tradition is like, and that's how
Yeah.
part of like how myth, I don't know, persists. Um, I mean, in terms of revisionary poetry, I love your another Achilles poem, by the way, in midlife.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Yeah,
Alternate universe.
yeah, I am kind of fascinated by the funny little. It comes up like a couple times with Achilles, and then with there's like the weird alternate history of the Trojan War where like Troy is said at some point, I don't know if it's in the Iliad or in the somewhere else, but like, it would have been possible for Troy to stand for 10 more years if some different decisions had been made. But in this timeline, it falls now.
Mm-hmm.
That there is like, there's a funny, it's an idea that I have like an intuitive sense of it, but that there's a slight difference between fate and destiny for the Greeks. That there's a sense of like, there is the inescapable
Right.
blade of Atropos, but then there's also a sense of potential that you're born with certain possibilities you can live up to or not.
Yeah.
But that the paths diverge, and that, taking like a Feynman, approach to it, like, well, maybe there's a universe for all of these possibilities.
Mm-hmm. But for so many, it's like on his appointed day, he went down. It's a thing for most people in most places. It's not postponable. But
yeah, I was talking to my friend David the other day about getting into our 40s, and I said, like, it occurs to me now that like Admetus was probably like a 19-year-old king. He was like, whoa, it's too early for me, because David was like, oh, if he was 40, he would have been like, let's get done with this. That's plenty.
Yeah.
You stick around, I'll test this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't remember like if I don't think in any of the versions I can think of right now that they had kids, right?
No mention of kids. Yeah.
The story. So it also speaks to maybe their youthfulness.
Yeah. And that his parents, who he says, like, maybe you could die for me, and they said, fuck that.
Yeah.
Like they were probably 40, like they weren't, I always imagine them being like ancient and wizened, but like, no, they were probably in the prime of their life.
Yeah. That was on a Greeking Out too.
Oh yeah.
Story, and yeah. But the Trojan War was, and just last night they were reading books about battles with my husband, and then my 5-year-old asked, Mama, are all the wars we read about real? Which was just like got my heart. But then my 7-year-old immediately said, no, the Trojan War wasn't real, Arthur. And like, it's like, it's so funny, like, to be the correct older brother. So
right. Yeah.
It all starts so early. And it was bedtime, but I was like, well, actually,
what you're reading, probably that didn't happen, but
that
it's
happened.
probably a thing that
in Turkey.
Yeah. And I mean, and like the Trojan War is like, it's for them, for so long of what, like, I feel like it was for them for like centuries upon centuries what like World War II has been for us for like 50 years, where it's just like, it's the go-to moral example. Like, here is what it means to be evil. Here is what it means to go too far. Here is what it means to fight for good or bad,
Here's what it means to be beloved by the gods. Here's what it means to be hated by the gods.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love it. I love it so much.
That was my conversation with Katie, author of Wolf Trees. You can find links to her stuff in the show notes. If you like the show and you think you might want to hear more, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and check out The Secret Show. Put your email address in and I'll give you a week's access for free. We put up an extra episode every week, and it's been, I think, pretty juicy and interesting lately. I've just got a lot of really good stuff in the can, and much of it is going to end up on The Secret Show. So please do go check that out, and welcome to all of you who have signed up recently. Again, that is SLEERICKETS.substack.com. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.